The space station, Kepler 442, floated alone in the darkness between stars, a bridge between worlds that had never met. Ambassador Tae-hyun stood at the observation deck and watched the planet below, a blue and green world that his people knew very little about. This world belonged to humans. He had read the reports, studied their brief history since first contact, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of seeing them face to face. Tae-hyun was tall and thin, with silver skin that reflected the starlight. His people, the Verdantine, had walked among the stars for 50,000 years. They had built cities on moons, created technologies that bent the rules of nature, and gathered together with 6 other great civilizations to form the Verdantine Collective. For thousands of years, the collective had ruled the known galaxy with careful diplomacy and measured responses to every situation. War was something they studied in history classes, an ancient thing that their ancestors had fought, but that modern civilization had moved beyond. His aide, Haiwan, entered the observation deck quietly. She was younger than Tae-hyun, with blue-gray skin and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She had been studying human culture since first contact, and her reports had grown increasingly more interesting as time passed. "They are ready to receive you," Haiwan said, her voice calm and professional. "The human delegation has arrived." Tae-hyun turned away from the window and nodded. "How many of them came?" "5, Haiwan replied. "The leader is a woman named Commander Ji-woo. According to their information system, she controls the military forces for their entire planet. The humans call this region of space their territory, though they have only recently begun to travel beyond their own star system." Tae-hyun felt a small flicker of something he almost recognized as amusement. Military forces. Territory. The words sounded ancient and unnecessary. "They still think in terms of war and control," he said more to himself than to Haiwan. "They have much to learn about modern civilization." The meeting room was designed to be neutral ground, decorated in the style of neither the Verdantine nor the humans. Wide windows showed the space beyond, and comfortable seats arranged in a circle suggested equality between all parties. When Tae-hyun entered, he saw the human delegation standing by the window, looking out at the stars. Commander Ji-woo turned as he approached. She was smaller than Tae-hyun, with dark skin, short black hair, and eyes that seemed to watch everything at once. She wore a uniform of gray and blue, and it took Tae-hyun a moment to realize that this was what human military leaders looked like. The other 4 humans stood slightly behind her, waiting. "Ambassador Tae-hyun," Ji-woo said, and her voice was steady and clear. "I am glad we finally have the chance to speak." "Commander," Tae-hyun replied, touching his palm to his chest in the Verdantine greeting. He noticed Ji-woo watching the gesture carefully, learning it, remembering it. "The collective is pleased to open dialogue with your people. We believe that understanding is always better than misunderstanding." "I agree completely," Ji-woo said, and she smiled a little. But Tae-hyun noticed that the smile did not reach her eyes. They sat down, and the real conversation began. Tae-hyun explained the collective to Ji-woo and her people. He spoke of the 7 civilizations that had come together, of the technologies they had developed, of the peace that had existed for thousands of years. He explained that the collective maintained control over certain resource-rich areas of space, and that new civilizations like humanity had to work within the systems that the collective had established. Ji-woo listened carefully, and she asked questions. Some of her questions showed that she did not fully understand the size and power of the collective. Some of her questions seemed to challenge what Tae-hyun was explaining, but she asked them in a calm voice, and her manner remained respectful. "So what you are saying," Ji-woo said slowly, "is that humanity cannot expand into certain areas of space because the collective has already claimed them." "That is correct," Ta-hyun said. The collective has established these boundaries through careful negotiation over many years. We offer humanity the opportunity to settle in areas that are not contested and to work with the collective to achieve a stable and peaceful arrangement. Ji-woo was quiet for a long moment. She looked out the window at the stars, and her face became very still. When she spoke again, her voice was different. It was quieter, but something in it had changed. The humans came to this region of space to find room to grow, she said. We have been on our world for all of our history, and we are ready to reach beyond our planet. We were hoping that you would help us to do this, but if the collective will not allow it, then we will need to make different choices. Tae-hyun felt a small warning in his mind, something that told him to listen carefully to the words behind her words. What do you mean by different choices? I mean, Ji-woo said, turning to look at him directly, that my people are not the kind of people who accept limits without question. We have fought for survival on our world for thousands of years. We have overcome many obstacles. Perhaps we are still learning your ways, Ambassador, but we are not people who give up easily. The warning in Tae-hyun's mind grew a little stronger, but he did not fully understand it. Not yet. He smiled at Ji-woo and said, I am sure we can find a solution that satisfies everyone. The collective has learned that cooperation is always better than conflict. Ji-woo's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. Cooperation, she repeated softly. Yes, I hope you are right about that, Ambassador. The meeting lasted for 3 more hours. By the end, no real agreement had been reached, but formal lines of communication had been established, and Tae-hyun was confident that in time, the humans would understand that working with the collective was in their best interest. They seemed intelligent enough. They simply needed time to accept reality. After the delegation left, Haiwan approached Tae-hyun in the observation deck. She looked worried about something. Did you notice, she asked quietly, how the humans watched our technology? How they studied every detail of our ships and our equipment? Tae-hyun had noticed, but he had not thought it was important. They are curious, he said. All young civilizations are curious about advanced technology. Perhaps, Haiwan said, but she was still looking out at the stars, and her expression remained concerned. Or perhaps they are taking notes, in case they need to know how to fight us. Tae-hyun almost laughed. The idea seemed impossible, but something in Haiwan's voice made him hold back the laugh. Instead, he stood beside her and watched the stars, and somewhere in his mind, that small warning continued to whisper. 2 weeks had passed since the meeting at Kepler 442, and the station had grown quiet. Tae-hyun spent his time writing reports to the Collective Council, describing his impression of the humans and offering suggestions about how to manage them in the future. He believed that patience and clear demonstration of the collective's power would eventually teach the humans to accept their place in the galaxy. This was how it had always worked with younger species. But then the encrypted message from Haiwan arrived. Tae-hyun was in his quarters when the signal came through. He opened it immediately, expecting perhaps a simple update about human culture or society. Instead, what he read made him stop, and read it again from the beginning. Ambassador, the message began, I am sending this communication through a secure channel because what I am witnessing here on Earth does not match anything in my previous reports. I recommend extreme caution in all future communications with the human government. Something is happening. Something significant. Tae-hyun sat down slowly. Haiwan had been stationed in the largest human city for the past 2 weeks, the city they called Seoul. She was there as a cultural observer, learning their customs and their way of life. Her position had given her access to public information systems and the ability to move through the city without drawing too much attention. Her message continued. The humans are mobilizing. I do not use this word lightly. Mobilizing. 3 days ago, all major human governments issued statements that seemed unrelated at first. Trade agreements with neighboring nations were suddenly revised. Military budgets were increased in every country. Universities began to restructure their research programs. News networks began broadcasting messages I did not understand at first, but which I now believe are preparations of some kind. Yesterday, I watched a factory worker finish his shift at a facility that produces consumer electronics. I followed him, and I observed him going to a military recruitment center. He enlisted immediately. But before he left the center, he communicated with someone, and that person went to a different government office. Within hours, that office had changed its operations completely. Ambassador, I believe the humans are preparing for something. I do not yet know what it is, but the speed and the coordination suggest a level of organization that should not be possible for a civilization at their development level. Tae-hyun continued reading, his confusion growing with each sentence. I attended a gathering at a public place called a plaza today. Thousands of humans had gathered there. They were not protesting anything. They were listening to speakers talk about unity and cooperation and sacrifice. And then something remarkable happened. The crowd began to move in a coordinated way. They split into different groups, each group moving in a different direction through the city. Within an hour, I observed that each group had entered a different type of facility. Some went to hospitals, some to schools, some to government buildings. They were organizing themselves, preparing themselves for something. Most disturbing is their emotional state. I expected to see fear, uncertainty, confusion. Instead, I see determination. I see what I can only describe as resolve. The humans seem to understand something that I do not yet understand, but it unites them completely. Tae-hyun read the final part of the message 3 times. I have reviewed all public human communication in the past 48 hours. 60% of their communication now relates directly to the meeting at Kepler 442. They are discussing the collective, your position, our resources, our power structure. And they are doing something that worries me greatly. They are discussing ways to oppose you. The humans do not appear to be preparing to accept collective authority. They appear to be preparing to resist it. I do not know if Commander Ji-woo explicitly ordered this response, but it is occurring nonetheless. I recommend that we understand better what the humans are thinking before we proceed with any further negotiations. Please advise. Tae-hyun sat in silence for a long time after reading the message. His first instinct was to dismiss it as misunderstanding. Haewon was intelligent, but she was still young, and this was her first assignment off the Verdantine homeworld. Perhaps she was simply misinterpreting what she was seeing. Perhaps the humans were simply undertaking some routine reorganization of their society. But something in his mind disagreed with this conclusion. He accessed the communication logs from the station and reviewed the recorded data from the meeting with Commander Ji-woo. He watched and listened to every word that had been spoken. He studied Ji-woo's expressions, her pauses, the moments when she was thinking about something beyond what she was saying out loud. When he reached the end of the meeting, Tae-hyun understood something. Ji-woo had not been negotiating. She had been gathering information. The questions she had asked were not questions designed to reach an agreement. They were questions designed to understand exactly what the collective would and would not allow so that she could plan her next move. Haewon was right, Tae-hyun said quietly to himself. He immediately composed a report for the collective council, forwarding Haewon's message along with his analysis. He was careful to present both possibilities. Perhaps the humans were simply reorganizing their society, but perhaps they were preparing for something else. The council needed to be aware of both possibilities. The response from the council came back much faster than Tae-hyun expected. It was a single message from the head of security, an ancient being named Korthan, who had seen many things in his long life. Continue observation, the message said. If the humans are preparing military action, this is their mistake. The collective has defended its position in space against many threats throughout history. One young civilization with primitive technology will not change this. Maintain diplomatic channels, but prepare defensive measures. If the humans wish to learn about power, we will teach them. And they will learn quickly. Tae-hyun forwarded the message to Hai-wan with added instructions to continue her observations and to be careful. But as he sat in his quarters looking out at the stars, something troubled him deeply. The collective had learned everything about defending itself except one thing. They had learned how to manage beings who accepted defeat. They had learned how to negotiate with civilizations that understood they were outmatched. But the collective had never encountered a civilization that looked at impossible odds and decided to fight anyway. Tae-hyun did not know if the humans would make this mistake. But if they did, he suspected that no one in the collective was truly prepared for what would happen next. 1 month after the initial warning from Hai-wan, Tae-hyun stood in the command center of Kepler 442 and watched what the collective council had decided to do. Against his recommendations to wait and observe more, against the advice of most diplomatic advisors, the council had chosen to act. They were launching a preemptive strike. Tae-hyun had argued against this decision in multiple communications. He had warned that the humans seemed to understand something about conflict that the collective had forgotten. He had suggested that forcing a confrontation now, before the collective understood human psychology better, was unwise. But the council had listened to the head of security instead, and Corthan had advised strength and immediate demonstration of power. If the humans are preparing for conflict, Corthan had said, then we show them that conflict with the collective is futile. One decisive military victory will teach them obedience faster than 1,000 years of negotiation. So now, as Tae-hyun watched the displays, he saw the collective fleet moving toward the outer territories where human ships were being constructed. The collective fleet was smaller than Tae-hyun had expected, but every ship was superior in technology and firepower to anything humanity had built. The collective command was confident. Victory projections showed human defeat in minutes. Maximum time estimate for the entire engagement was 30 minutes. Hai-wan sat beside Tae-hyun, watching the same displays. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking slightly. "How long until contact?" Tae-hyun asked the commander of the station. 12 minutes, the commander replied. His name was Rendal, and he had commanded this station for 100 years without incident. "The human fleet is not moving. They appear to be waiting for us." Tae-hyun felt something in his chest tighten. The humans were waiting. They had known this was coming. The countdown on the displays showed the collective ships moving closer. Tae-hyun could see the human vessels now on the visual feed, small and crude-looking compared to the elegant collective cruisers. There were perhaps 50 human ships, arranged in a formation that looked almost haphazard until Tae-hyun studied it more carefully. Then he began to understand the formation. It was designed to protect a central cluster of ships, and it was designed to force any attacking fleet to engage across a wide area rather than concentrating their firepower. The humans had thought about this. They had prepared. "Contact in 3 minutes," the commander announced. Hai-wan reached over and took Tae-hyun's hand. He squeezed it gently, trying to project confidence he did not entirely feel. The first collective strike came from 3 cruisers firing simultaneously at the human formation. The weapons were energy-based, technology that the humans could not possibly have a defense against. The beams of pure energy reached across the space between the 2 fleets in an instant. And then, something happened that made everyone in the command center fall silent. The human ships moved. Not all of them. Some of them stood still and took the fire directly, but others moved to block the strike, positioning themselves between the attacking fleet and the ships they were protecting. The energy beams struck the human vessels, and they exploded instantly, consumed by the superior firepower. "They are sacrificing ships to protect the others," Rendall said slowly, as if he could not quite believe what he was seeing. The human response came next, but it was not what Tae-hyun expected. Instead of attempting to match the collective's firepower, the human ships changed course completely. They accelerated directly toward the collective fleet, moving faster than should have been possible. Alarms began to sound in the command center. "They are performing ramming maneuvers," the weapons officer said, her voice rising slightly with surprise and then alarm. 6 human ships accelerated into the collective formation, but their paths were not random. They were coordinated, designed to force the collective ships to change course and break their formation. 3 of the human ships rammed collective vessels, and both human and collective ships exploded in cascades of light. But in the confusion, the human fleet had done exactly what they needed to do. They had broken the collective's coordinated attack. "This is not how the simulation predicted this would proceed," Rendall said quietly. Tae-hyun watched as the battle continued, and what he saw troubled him more with each passing moment. The humans were not fighting like they wanted to win. They were fighting like they had to win. There was something fundamentally different about the way they moved, the way they sacrificed their ships, the way they coordinated their efforts. 5 minutes into the battle, the collective had lost 1 cruiser and suffered damage to 2 others. The humans had lost 12 ships, more than 20% of their fleet. But the human fleet was still fighting, still pressing forward, still attempting to close distance and cause damage. 15 minutes into the battle, the situation had become unclear. The collective still had superior firepower, but the humans had initiative. They were not fighting reactively, responding to what the collective was doing. They were fighting actively, pushing their own strategy, forcing the collective to respond to them. 20 minutes into the battle, something remarkable happened. 1 human pilot, in a badly damaged ship with failing systems, deliberately accelerated his vessel directly into the path of a collective cruiser's primary weapon. The human ship exploded, but the explosion happened at exactly the right moment to disable the collective weapon. And then the human's wingmate used that moment of vulnerability to strike a crippling blow against the collective cruiser. "The collective is requesting reinforcements," Rendall announced. They are requesting assistance. They say they are not winning." Tae-hyun and Hai-wan exchanged a look. The collective was not winning. Against a fleet with worse technology, against a species that should have been easy to defeat, the collective was not winning. The battle continued for another hour, with the tide continuing to shift slowly toward the humans. The collective had not lost yet, but they were losing. And as Tae-hyun watched the humans continue to fight, continue to sacrifice their ships and their pilots, continue to press forward despite losses that should have broken them, he finally understood what he had failed to see before. The humans were not afraid of losing. They were afraid of not fighting. When the collective fleet finally began to withdraw, it was with the understanding that they could not win this engagement. Human forces had demonstrated something remarkable. They had taken technology that was inferior and tactics that were improvised, and they had used sheer determination and willingness to sacrifice to hold their ground against a vastly more advanced enemy. As the engagement ended, Tae-hyun watched a transmission come through on the station's communication system. It was Commander Ji-woo, and she was broadcasting to all human forces. "We have momentum," her voice said, calm and clear. "We have unity. We have something they have forgotten. We have everything to lose and everything to gain. We march forward." The camera panned across millions of soldiers in formation, their faces set with determination. Tae-hyun finally understood the look he had seen in Ji-woo's eyes during their first meeting. It was not the look of someone negotiating a better position. It was the look of someone who had already made her choice and who had accepted whatever came next. The war had truly begun. 3 months into the war, Tae-hyun had received over 200 reports from Hae-won, and each one made him understand the humans better and fear their potential more. The war was not going the way the Collective Council had predicted. In fact, it was becoming something that the Collective had no experience dealing with. It was total war. Hae-won's latest message described the human world as if describing something she barely recognized. The society had transformed completely. Factories that had once produced consumer electronics now manufactured weapon systems. Universities that had taught philosophy and history now focused entirely on military engineering and strategy. News networks that had reported entertainment stories now showed only military broadcasts and casualty reports. The change had been total and immediate. But what struck Tae-hyun most about Hae-won's reports was not the speed of change or the completeness of it. What struck him was how willing the humans seemed to be to make these changes. Hae-won had observed a young woman named Min-ai who worked in a weapons facility. Min-ai was 20 years old, and she spent 16 hours a day manufacturing components for advanced weapon systems. But in the evenings, instead of resting, she attended a military academy where she studied tactical analysis and weapons design. She was learning how to make the weapons she built more effective at killing other beings. When Tae-hyun read about Min-ai, he had to stop and sit in silence for a long time. But Min-ai was not unusual. Hae-won reported thousands of similar cases. An elderly man named Kyung-soo, who had spent his entire life working as a teacher, volunteered to pilot supply shuttles through combat zones. He was older and less useful in combat than younger pilots, but he understood that supply lines were what kept the human military functioning. He went where he was needed and did what was needed to be done. A woman named Jin-ho worked as a nurse in a civilian hospital, but she had also volunteered for a program to provide combat medical support on the front lines. She moved between the world of peace and healing and the world of war and death, helping where she could in both places. The humans were not just preparing for war. They were transforming their entire civilization into an instrument of war. And they were doing it not because they had been ordered to do so by some authoritarian government, but because they had chosen to do it. Each human had made an individual decision to contribute to the effort, and those decisions had created something far more powerful than any single order could have created. Tae-hyun tried to explain this to the Collective Council in his reports, but he was not sure they understood. The Council was accustomed to civilizations that fought because they were told to fight, or because they had something to gain by fighting. The Council was not accustomed to civilizations that fought because something inside them demanded that they fight. The military reports that Tae-hyun received painted a similar picture. The Collective was still winning most individual engagements. Their technology was still superior. Their weapons were still more effective, but they were winning at a cost, and the cost was growing. 5 human soldiers could not match 1 collective soldier in combat, but 20 human soldiers, fighting with the knowledge that they were fighting for their home and their families and their future, could hold a position against 50 collective soldiers. The humans fought with a desperation that no training could provide. They fought like they were already fighting for their lives, because from their perspective, they were. And slowly, engagement by engagement, the Collective began to realize something troubling. They were not just fighting a war. They were fighting against a civilization that had decided that survival was worth any cost. The Collective began to lose supply lines. Humans attacked with no concern for whether they could successfully hold the territories they conquered. They simply wanted to disrupt collective operations, to make the Collective's war more difficult, to force the Collective to spread their forces thinner and thinner. The Collective lost a major command station when a human assault force flew their ships directly into the station's core, destroying it completely and killing everyone on board, including themselves. No other civilization in the Collective's history had sacrificed that many of their own soldiers just to destroy a single facility. But the humans had done it, and they had done it without hesitation. HFY's reports from Earth described a world that was becoming harder and harder to recognize. The humans were working longer hours, eating less, sleeping less. Their children were being taught military strategy and weapons design as part of their basic education. The elderly were being mobilized to fill roles in the civilian workforce so that younger, stronger humans could be sent to the front lines. But none of them were complaining. None of them were asking for the war to end. None of them were questioning whether the fight was worth it. They had made their choice, and they were committed to that choice completely. In one of her reports, HFY wrote, "I attended a ceremony today on Earth. It was a memorial for humans who had died in combat. The humans called it a funeral. The families of the dead were grieving, as one would expect. But their grief was not leading them to demand peace. Instead, their grief seemed to strengthen their commitment to the war. The family members of one deceased soldier enlisted in the military that same day. They said they wanted to complete what my brother started. I do not understand this response. I do not understand how grief creates commitment instead of hesitation." But Tae-hyun was beginning to understand. The humans were not fighting because they expected victory. They were fighting because not fighting was not an option. Their commitment to the war had become part of their identity. To stop fighting would be to reject who they had become. The collective council was now beginning to feel the pressure of the conflict. Supply lines were stretched. Military forces were tired. New conflicts were developing on the edges of collective space as other civilizations began to wonder if the collective was truly as powerful as it had always claimed to be. And the humans kept fighting. Tae-hyun received a report that Admiral Tae-oh had led a devastating assault against a collective supply depot. Tae-oh had sacrificed half of his fleet to achieve the goal. But he had achieved it. When asked by his superiors if the cost had been worth it, Tae-oh had simply responded, "The humans will decide if it was worth it when they see how much damage we can do when we are willing to pay any price." The war, which the collective council had expected to win in a matter of weeks, was now 3 months old, and there was no end in sight. Tae-hyun sat in his quarters on Kepler 442, watching the reports come in, watching the casualty numbers grow, watching the humans continue to fight despite impossible odds, and he finally admitted to himself what he had known since the first engagement at Epsilon Station. The collective was not going to win this war. They might defeat the human military. They might destroy human ships and kill human soldiers. But they were never going to achieve what they had set out to achieve, which was to make the humans understand that resistance was futile. The humans had already made a different choice. They had already decided that resistance was not just possible, but necessary. And that decision was more powerful than any weapon the collective possessed. 6 months into the conflict, the war had reached a turning point that no one in the collective council had anticipated. The humans had begun to win, not in every engagement, but in the overall direction of the war. The collective still had superior technology and greater numbers, but the humans had something more valuable. They had momentum. Admiral Tae-oh had emerged as humanity's greatest military leader, a man whose tactical brilliance combined with a complete willingness to sacrifice made him nearly impossible to defeat. In a brilliant maneuver that shocked the entire collective military establishment, Tae-oh had led an assault on the collective's primary supply lines. He had known that this attack would cost him 70% of his fleet. He had known that the human forces would suffer devastating losses. He had done it anyway because he understood something that the collective commanders still did not fully grasp. Sometimes the most important victory is the one that costs everything. The supply lines were cut. The collective forces in the outer territories began to starve for resources. Ships could not be repaired. Weapons could not be resupplied. Soldiers could not be reinforced, and then the humans pushed forward. Tae-hyun watched the military reports come through with growing disbelief. Engagement after engagement that the Collective Council had expected the humans to lose, the humans were actually winning. Not because their individual soldiers were better, but because they were willing to sacrifice more, to push harder, to refuse to stop fighting even when it seemed like the logical choice would be to retreat. The collective command structure began to crumble under the pressure. Ancient generals who had fought wars thousands of years in the past found themselves unable to adapt to an enemy that refused to follow the established rules of engagement. A civilization that was supposed to be more advanced, more sophisticated, more civilized than humanity, was finding itself outmatched by beings who simply refused to give up. Haywan's reports from Earth described a world that had transformed even further. The victory broadcasts had begun. Not celebrations exactly, but acknowledgments that the impossible was becoming possible. Humans who had been working at home in the factories began to volunteer for military service. Children asked their parents if they could become soldiers so that they could help defend their world. The commitment to the war had become total and absolute. But what troubled Tae-hyun most was not the humans' commitment to victory. It was the complete absence of arrogance or overconfidence. The humans were not celebrating their successes. Instead, they were using each victory as an opportunity to understand what they had done right and what they could improve. They were treating victory not as an end point, but as a continuation of the fight with better resources. One of Haywan's latest reports included an observation that haunted Tae-hyun. The humans do not smile anymore. I have been on Earth for 7 months now, and I have observed that human smiling has nearly disappeared from their society. There is focus, there is determination, there is even occasionally laughter. But the casual expression of happiness, the smile that humans once showed freely, it has been replaced by something else. It has been replaced by resolve. The humans have focused themselves so completely on the goal of winning this war that everything else has fallen away. Tae-hyun realized that the humans had achieved something remarkable and terrifying. They had united their entire civilization around a single goal. Every human, from the oldest to the youngest, from the strongest to the weakest, was contributing to the war effort. And because of this unity, because of this complete dedication, the humans were beginning to do what the collective had thought was impossible. They were winning. The moment of true turning came when the collective's council received a message from the field commanders. The human forces were not just defending anymore. They were pushing forward into collective territory. They were taking over resource centers and military bases. They were expanding their presence in space at an accelerating rate. The council called an emergency session. Tae-hyun was invited to attend through a holographic projection. He watched as the most powerful beings in the galaxy argued about what to do. Korthan, the head of security, looked diminished. The confidence that had marked his previous communications was gone. "We have miscalculated," he said, his ancient voice barely above a whisper. "We have miscalculated what these humans are capable of." Another council member, a being named Velhiz, spoke up. "We should continue the fight. We still have superior forces. Victory is still possible." But the council leader, an ancient being who had lived for over 100,000 years, held up a hand to stop the argument. "No," she said. "Korthan is correct. We have miscalculated. We have been fighting a war against beings who refuse to follow the rules of warfare that we understand. We have been measuring victory and defeat in the way we have always measured it. But the humans are measuring it differently. For them, the only defeat is stopping the fight. And they have shown no indication that they will ever stop." The council leader looked directly at Tae-hyun's holographic projection. "Ambassador Tae-hyun, you have been observing this war since the beginning. Tell us what you have learned." Tae-hyun took a breath. He had been thinking about this question for a long time. He knew what he needed to say, but he also knew that the council would not want to hear it. "We are losing," Taehyun said simply. "Not because the humans have better weapons or better ships or better soldiers. We are losing because the humans have something we no longer understand. They have something worth fighting for. When the collective forced them to choose between submission and conflict, they chose conflict. And having made that choice, they have committed themselves completely to it." The council chamber was silent. "The humans believe they are fighting for their survival," Taehyun continued. "In their minds, if they lose this war, their civilization will be destroyed. They will be subjugated. Their freedom will be taken. Their future will be controlled by others. And because they believe this, they will fight with everything they have, for as long as they have to fight, and they will accept any cost to achieve victory." Vel has attempted to interrupt, but the council leader gestured for silence. "We have a choice," Taehyun said. "We can continue this war and face defeat. Or we can end it now, while we still have the strength to do so with some dignity. But if we continue, if we force the humans to continue to fight, I believe they will ultimately destroy us. Not because they are more advanced, but because they are more desperate, and more desperate beings are always more dangerous than confident ones." The council chamber fell silent again. Taehyun could see the realization spreading across the faces of the ancient beings who governed the collective. They had been the most powerful force in the known galaxy for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to meet an enemy that could not be defeated by superior power. That enemy had always been determination, and the humans had it in abundance.